I'm Justine Rosenthal, editor of the National Interest. We are here today with Dan Drezner, a senior editor at the National Interest and professor at Tufts, and also numerous other titles. I'm not even sure.
I've got a whole list.
A whole list. And we're going to talk today about the financial crisis, the new data that came out on the U.S. GDP, and we're hoping you can walk us through what you think the meaning of all of this is. So let's start with these figures that came out that the GDP is down, what, 6%?
More than 6% for the fourth quarter of 2008, which everyone knew was going to go down, but that was a much larger number, I think, than anyone was expecting. I think it's the largest decline since 1983. And if you graph sort of the trend in terms of output and unemployment and compare it to previous recessions, basically we're in sort of uncharted territory. This does not look like any recession during the post-war period. Now, I should stress that it also doesn't look like the Great Depression yet either. That's a whole order of magnitude worse, but we're in new territory.
It's an order of magnitude worse, the 1930s that is, but
yeah.
Does this look eerily similar? Does it look like we're on the cusp of having something that could be like the 1930s?
Well, one way in which it looks eerily similar is the way in which you're seeing every economy in the world trending in the same direction. I mean, the Great Depression was a global depression by and large. The only countries that managed to stave it off did so at enormous domestic cost, like the Soviet Union. The fact is that every major economy in the world right now, with the possible exception of China, has negative growth right now. Europe is in its deepest recession in the post-war era. Japan is in serious recession. The United States is. That's the OECD economies. The BRIC economies, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, are not doing any better. Russia's fiscal situation looks relatively perilous. So does Brazil's. India's not quite as bad, but still not great.
Now you say that with the exception potentially of China, everyone is going downhill. My sense has been, and correct me then if I'm wrong, that we don't really know China's growth because we can't rely on the figures that are coming out.
That's correct. There's an increasing sense of desperation in China's repeated affirmation that they are going to have 8% growth this year. And you're beginning to wonder if it's their mantra that they're just saying to make them feel better. And it's true, you can't rely on official figures with regard to China. I don't know, it would not shock me if China has negative growth this year as well also. I mean, one of the things that the crisis has revealed is the myth that is decoupling. A lot of people talked earlier last year about the idea that the BRIC economies in particular were decoupling from the United States and Europe, that even if the US and Europe went into a recession, it would not affect the growth of these other economies because they were trading with each other so much. That was just wrong in the end. It turned out that while these countries were trading with each other, they were in the end extremely dependent upon the US and European markets. And so this shows the extent to which the global economy is still integrated. Unfortunately, it also means that everyone is now falling at the same time, and that's not terribly good.
Can you walk us through this 8% growth obsession? I mean, I think some people understand that the Chinese government has said we have to have 8%, we have to maintain 8% growth or above to have stability.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a sense of why they're coming up with that number? How realistic is that number? Will they really be okay, particularly with internal stability questions if they have negative growth?
I'm not sure. I will confess slight ignorance about why 8% as opposed to 7% or 9%. I mean, I'm not sure why it's the 8% figure, or how they calculated that. But it is the figure that every Chinese official talks about, and the reason is that there's an implicit social contract that's been talked about for the last 2 decades since Tiananmen between the Chinese population and the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party will provide at least 8%, per annum growth. And in return, the Chinese population will not revolt. Now, the reason it's probably that figure is that you have roughly, I think, 20 million Chinese peasants per year trying to move from the agricultural hinterlands and taking non-agricultural jobs. So to maintain that kind of job growth, you need 8% growth a year probably. And what we're seeing now over the last quarter is the reverse. You're actually seeing Chinese workers move from the cities back to the hinterlands because there are no jobs in the cities at this point. You're seeing a lot of factories shut down. And you're, not surprisingly, seeing increases in protests and demanding back wages be paid and demanding for greater social safety nets and what have you.
Let me move you to a different region, over to Europe. There was so much talk, even prior to the crisis, that the euro was going to replace the dollar, that if nothing else, there was a visceral sense that people would prefer to be pegged to the euro. What does this financial crisis mean for that kind of conversation, especially since the European economies look to be in trouble?
It means that conversation is now in the realm of fantasyland, crudely put. There have always been problems about whether or not the euro would ever supplant the dollar. The euro has a lot of strengths, among other things. It seems to maintain its value a little better than the dollar has. The problem is that there's always been an opaqueness, not entirely sure of the word, to how the European Central Bank decides on things like interest rates and when it's going to do in terms of open market operations. And that was always an inherent uncertainty with regard to the euro. Plus, there is no European-wide bond market in a way that there is in terms of the U.S. Treasury. The U.S. Treasury can issue debt denominated in dollars. The Europeans have no central facility to issue euro bonds. Mm-hmm. And so as a result, it doesn't have a deep and liquid enough capital market to replace the dollar. Furthermore, the sort of internal squabbling you've seen since the crisis, the Germans just vetoed the idea of a euro bond market, for example. And as a result, furthermore, you've got potentially Greece and Italy leaving the euro. You have Eastern European economies in serious crisis. So as a result, the risk premia for the euro has gone up dramatically. And again, while the U.S. economy might not be doing great, when you compare it to the other viable markets, suddenly it doesn't look as bad. It's always a relative question.
Why have the European economies seemed to come out so poorly in all of this? So much worse than the United States, even potentially worse than most Asian countries, I would think, absent Japan.
Well, their financial sector in some ways is even worse straits than the U.S. financial sector. Their banks were much more heavily leveraged, and their banks were much deeper into things like the subprime mortgage mess and collateralized debt obligations and a lot of other terms that I can throw around that no one is entirely sure what they mean. So the financial sector is in a deeper mess. And obviously, the general observation is that European economies are less flexible than the American economy. It's not a great thing to see unemployment go up in the United States. On the other hand, that is a natural reaction to declining output. Europe is in much tighter straits there because it's much tougher to fire people in Europe. And as a result, job creation is also much less in Europe. So it's just a much more sluggish economic zone.
Let me close by asking you, who comes out on top at the end of all this? And coupled with that, I know it's difficult to predict, but how long do you think we will be in this kind of very deep recession?
To answer the second question first, if I knew that, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be sitting on my yacht in the Atlantic. It's going to be at least a year or two. It's going to be longer, I think, than people have projected today. Ben Bernanke said earlier this week that he thinks the economy is going to get out in this year, and I really want him to be right. I'm just extremely pessimistic that he is. In terms of who comes out on top, I can give you one of two answers, and I honestly don't know. The first answer is that remarkably, whenever there's been a major disjuncture like this, the United States has always been surprisingly, even if it's the United States' fault that we're in this mess, the U.S. has always been remarkably flexible and capable of reacting to this quickly. You saw this with the end of Bretton Woods in 1971. You saw this with the oil shocks of the 70s. You saw it with the end of the Cold War in 1990. So the United States has always managed to respond more quickly than other economies. On the other hand, the one thing this crisis has done is actually worsened the kind of macroeconomic imbalance that the U.S. has, particularly with China. And the only way that's going to get...
Let me stop you for 1 second. What does that mean?
What it means is that we're running a current account deficit that could choke a horse, and that China, in response, has been buying, it now owns, I believe the latest estimate is $1.7 trillion worth of U.S. debt. Now, it's been doing this in the past because it's doing it to keep the yuan undervalued as a way to keep its export engine growing, as a way to continue on employing Chinese. That system can't sustain itself over time. And as a result, the only way that's going to change is if the U.S. starts consuming less and saves more, and China starts consuming more and saves less. So in the end, what that has to mean is that the Chinese economy, the domestic economy, has to grow by a much larger amount. So if this ever does settle out, it's going to mean that China, relatively speaking, is larger than it is now vis-a-vis the United States. I don't think that means it supplants the U.S. in terms of hegemony or anything like that, but it means that China's going to have more relative power.
All right, Dan, I think it's a perfect stopping point. Thank you for taking the time to do this with us.
Always a pleasure, Justine.